beast!
Oh,
Hell.
yeah.
Welcome back, Truth Seekers. So happy to have you today for another exciting edition of the show. My guest this afternoon is a college professor, a prominent writer, and the author of the most recent book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism. His name is Dr. Paul Kengor, PhD. Doctor, welcome to the show. Nice to see you. How are you?
Yeah, good, TJ. Thanks so much. Good to be with you.
So you're an anti-communist. What a drag, man. They would have ran you out of the 60s on a rail. McCarthyites. How are you even teaching? Right. I don't get it.
Well, I'm not that old. I was born in the 60s, but I wasn't of age in the 60s. But given this audience, I think you guys will appreciate this. So I was a college student in the late 80s when the Berlin Wall fell.
Nice.
And I was actually I was a pre-med student, and I was at the University of Pittsburgh. I was working for my student newspaper. I was the editorial page editor. And I got to tell you, TJ, I was totally apolitical. I didn't know what a conservative was, didn't know what a liberal was, but I did know that I was watching all these events go on around me, and I knew, among other things, I couldn't see how anybody could be a communist. I at least understood that much.
Right.
And so, but ever since then, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, one of the things that I've been trying to warn people about is that this is the most lethal ideology in history. And, this is, despite what I hear on a lot of college campuses, that, Communist Manifesto is really a pretty good book if you just read it. It's not. It's an awful book. It's a horrific book. And I know that when somebody has said that they haven't actually read the book. Open the book and read it. It's very brief, and all you got to do is get about halfway through it and say, this ideology, this is horrible. They're going to have to kill 100 million people if you try to implement this. But for some reason, it's continued. Well, I know the reason, because of academia in particular, and what's being taught, or better yet, what's not being taught in our college campuses.
Right. So, I read the entire book. It's almost 400 pages, and it was excellent. And every time I had an aha moment, I thought, I wonder why I didn't learn this in school. I wonder why no one ever talks about this. And then a chapter later, you go, and if you're not surprised, if nothing you've read in this sounds familiar to you, let me drop this bomb on you. I thought, all right, Dr. Kengor's way ahead of me here. I feel like this book should be required reading for any high school graduate before they go to college. Like, instead of giving them that graduation present in monetary terms, you just hand them this book and say, hey, look, have this finished before summer's over. What do you think about that?
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. And, there's the famous maxim, aphorism by George Santayana, which is probably overquoted, right? But those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And it's really true. And you see that now in surveys of Americans generally, not just millennials. Everybody picks on millennials, right? But really, we're seeing this in survey data on Americans generally. One of the surveys that I give in the book, one of the poll results. This was done this time last year by a group called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is trying to do with communism what has been done with Nazism and fascism. Remind Americans, remind the world of the horrors of the ideology. But they found that not a majority, thankfully, but a disturbingly high number of Americans, it's close to a third, actually believe that George W. Bush is responsible for more deaths than Joseph Stalin.
Makes sense. Sure.
It's just incredible. It's just an unbelievable thing. And really, everybody should know that, well, I was going to say Stalin's the greatest killer in human history. Actually, is not. Mao is, right? But the top two, Stalin and Mao, are communists. And Hitler's responsible for the deaths of about 6 million Jews, about 10 million people altogether, 6 million Jews, another 4 million what he called misfits, undesirables, gypsies, Slavs. While Stalin, the latest numbers on Stalin, Alexander Yakovlev, Yale University Press Book, 2002, said that Stalin alone may have, quote, annihilated 60 to 70 million people. So that's like 6 to 7 times the number of people that Hitler killed. And so people don't even know that. And then, of all things, to think that George W. Bush killed more people, that's madness. But you could only believe that if you spent the last 4 years in a university where all you heard is Bush bad, Bush bad, Bush bad, right? Bush evil, Bush, and nothing about the evils of communism.
It must be surreal to think about when I'm reading this and I see videos online about college kids, Antifa or trying to ban guns, and they ask them simple questions about why you believe this or why socialism is important, and they don't know squat, right? And I think you look at the ideology and the way they want to subvert education, this must make the communist forefathers very, very happy. And how does that feel to be in the middle of the profession, in the eye of the storm, knowing that their goal was to take over the education pulpits so that kids, I think you quoted Lenin by saying that if you give me a child an education for 4 years, he'll never be uprooted, something to that effect.
Yeah, that's right. It's an amazing amazing quote, especially given that he said 4 years, which is exactly the time of a bachelor's degree in the United States, right? Or actually, I should probably say, I think it's 5.75 years. Turns is the average.
They're trying to speed it up for the smart ones and get them to 3. But yeah, I get your point.
Right, but he pretty much he nailed that exactly right. If there is one good kind of glimmer of light in these surveys, TJ, it's that when you ask these folks, well, how do you define communism, right? They don't say things like right out of the book, which is, well, like it says in the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, the entire communist theory may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. That's why I like it, right? They don't say that. They'll say, well, like it says in the Communist Manifesto, because communism abolishes all truths. It abolishes all religion. Because it calls for the abolition of the family. Because, like they say, it calls for the most radical rupture in traditional relations. They don't actually give accurate answers. They say, well, because communism talks about sharing, about treating your fellow man the right way, about redistributing wealth, about taking from the rich and giving to the poor. So if there's good news in this, it might be that if we could actually teach them the truth about it, then maybe they wouldn't believe it. But the key is teaching them the truth, and that is an uphill battle because, like you just said, I mean, the Marxists, and in particular the cultural Marxists, which is a whole other area of Marxism that people are totally oblivious about. In fact, if you Googled cultural Marxism right now, I shudder to think what it would even say on Wikipedia about it. But it's really the new left 60s cultural Marxists that really took over the universities. And that's where the worst damage has been done.
So let's kind of break that down. I want to get into the hard-hitting stuff for people really curious what you wrote about in this book. And the first notes I had were about religion and family and the culture side, which, of course, the Soviets could enforce it by the bayonet, by the rifle, and by the gulag. But when people ask if I believe in evolution, I say, of course, look at the way bad ideas evolve over time. Look at that, the spiritual evolution of warfare of that battlefield. So let's talk about anti-religion. I trolled somebody on YouTube the other day and said, okay, it was an atheist page. I go, you look at the founding fathers, you look at Marx, you look at Engels, you look at Lenin, you look at Trotsky, and then their proteges, you look at Mussolini, you look at Hitler, you look at Pol Pot, you look at Ho Chi Minh, you look at the cultural leftists today. They all had some things in common. And the first one was they hated religion. They hate it. Let's start with that. Yeah,
they did. And in fact, look at people like Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa, who were inspired by religion to do what they did. And look at some of the abolitionists, William Wilberforce and others, right? They were inspired to abolish the slave trade through their Christian faith. And we know that Christians do bad things. I mean, in fact, read the Bible. I'll tell you, Christian, the religious people do bad things. But yeah, these biggest of the butchers, especially on the communist side, they hated religion. They went after religion. Marx called religion the opiate of the masses, and Marx also said in a quote that hasn't really is not as popular, not as well known. He said, communism begins where atheism begins. Vladimir Lenin said, all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia. Now imagine that. Google that one, folks, all right? Necrophilia, okay? He said, there is nothing more abominable than religion. Lenin said, I ripped off the cross from my neck as a teenager and I threw it in the rubbish bin. So they hated religion, and they saw religion as, among other things, a competitor, a rival for this totalitarian idea of communism, which really seeks to fundamentally transform human nature. So for them, God had to go. The scriptures had to go. Anything that formed a rival belief system, which above all religion does, because there's nothing more transforming than a religious faith. So they sought to completely reject it, to completely annihilate it, and they weren't just content with people not practicing. I mean, they wanted people. I talk about the late Richard Wurmbrand, who wrote the book Tortured for Christ. I mean, they wanted you in the public square standing up saying there is no God. They weren't happy until you were actively and openly renouncing the faith. And if you didn't do it, they would put you in the gulag, they would put you in prison, and in many cases, they would just line you right up and shoot you.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously know during the invasions in the World War II, when the priests and pastors were lined up in city squares and shot, Mussolini, Hitler, they did this. But you go into more detail in the gulags and in Chairman Mao's regime, where they were locked up and tortured, and they were, you talk about the priests having to basically sacramentize excrement and people defecating, urinating on each other, and all of it so that they would profess that there was no God. And there was one example you gave, I can't remember the gentleman's name, where his son was tortured to death in front of him, all so they could get a confession. And I thought, this is the militant faith of these atheists. What was the analogy you gave? The godless atheist perverts, that they can't tolerate any competition, especially on a spiritual level. It has to be purged, not just denied.
Yeah, that was Harry Truman's phrase, right? Godless pervert systems, as he referred to the Soviet systems. And the pastor that you're talking about was a Romanian pastor. Yeah, they were. In fact, Richard Wurmbrand, another Romanian pastor who knew that pastor, said that he actually had communists torturing him, yelling, "We are the devil," and he said to one of them, I don't understand. Why do you hate so much? Why are you so full of hatred? And one of his torturers said, I've lived all of my life to express this hatred that's in my heart against you right now. And so it was, I mean, look, some folks believe that this was flat out satanic, that this wasn't just atheism by some of those in the communist religion, but actually a satanic influence altogether. And Wurmbrand said that. He said, just describing them as atheists isn't sufficient. There was a hatred here beyond just not believing in God, as if they were really motivated and driven by a darker, deeper force. And if anyone thinks that that's overdoing it, well, then pause for a second and circle back to what we said at the beginning of this conversation. There's no ideology in history that has killed as many people as communism. I mean, it killed way more than the fascists. By the way, Mussolini was a Marxist, right? So Mussolini was a fascist, indeed, but he was also a Marxist. So I mean, when you consider that this is the all-time leader in terms of killing, you might argue that there was a genuine satanic element to this, far beyond just kind of general run-of-the-mill anti-religious atheism.
Yeah, and we're pretty much done with this topic, but I had a good friend of mine who's atheist, and we talk about this all the time. And I said, look, if you believe as I do that religion is the search for ultimate truth, right, and there are different brands and varieties and flavors of it, we have to caution ourselves against bad behavior, because we bring things on ourselves through inaction, through apathy, through believing false things and acting in bad ways, right? So you can always cite a Christian who's done something bad. There are consequences to that. But I happen to believe that if you're on that path, that any other path or not believing to the opposite sides of the deities, those are equal to me. So that if you're not on a path and you reject it completely, atheism to the divine is just as bad as a false religion, because ultimately you're rejecting truth and it's outright. And this is where that slippery slope goes, to the point where if someone doesn't have a soul, then they can be disposable. And what I want to talk about at some point in this conversation is how that attitude has transferred to today's time. If you don't have a soul, then you don't have a gender. If you don't have a soul, then anything goes. I mean, this is the same kind of attitude they had, and Hitler did the same thing. We watch these Nazi documentaries where these old Nazis say, we were taught that these people were not human. We were taught that they didn't deserve to exist. We were taught that they needed to be purged, and we had no qualms about it. And some of them, to this day, I still think we did the right thing. But, it was bad. Maybe I shouldn't have. Killing is bad, but I
could give you examples like that, exact statements like that from some North Korean dissidents who said the same thing. We were taught that these people really weren't people. They really didn't have human dignity. And I would add here, too, on the atheism point, George W. Bush used to talk about how the fact that he's a Christian means that, in his view, someone is watching me. as he put it. And the fact that you believe that someone is watching you that can hold you accountable eternally for your actions, and that could also damn you to hell if you've chosen to do evil, that's a powerful check on a person's conscience and actions. Now keep in mind, it could still mean that you make bad decisions and you make wrong decisions. And it can mean that George W. Bush deciding to go into Iraq was a bad decision. But the fact that he was at least praying about it, seeking to do God's will, at least he's got an external check on his decisions. Whereas the atheist, a Stalin or a Lenin, says, there's no God, there's no hell, there's no devil, there's no eternal damnation. I could do whatever I please. I could kill as many people as I want because I'm just here for the here and now. And so, and understanding that atheists do good things, believers do bad things, but still, that check, that eternal check, that I would tell atheists, you want that in a leader. You want someone who thinks that someone is watching him, because he might not always make good decisions, but at least he has that as a counter to what he's doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned early in the book that you were teaching maybe one of your first classes, and the other teacher was horrified when you gave your lecture on communism and used the term, I'm going to teach a softer communism. And that line right there is one that I've used. My favorite atheist is Marquis de Sade, who said the only morality is my own. And so when I hear this argument that you don't need God to tell you to be a good person, and George W. Bush is an idiot if he needs someone in the sky to tell him that, I said, sure, that's fine. But Lenin said, I think it was Lenin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the only moral absolute is the one that benefits class, right? We make our own rules
that's right.
As we go.
Well, and Dostoevsky said, if God does not exist, everything is permissible.
Right.
Because you become your own bearer of truth. You become your own definer of truth. And when you can define whatever words mean and whatever truth is, that can go in a really dangerous direction.
All right, I'm going to speed up. I took too much time there. I know you got to go soon. So let's talk about more links that bind these people and their ideology. Let's talk about how many of these revolutionaries, the ones I mentioned, I think I missed Pol Pot, and then you also have Che and Fidel. How many of them were upper middle class people who studied in Europe and brought these bad ideas home with them to destroy their countries? Yeah,
most of them were. This whole idea that communism comes from the common man, right? That it comes grassroots from poor people, the kids in the factories. In fact, Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and those guys who were in the Weather Underground from SDS, Mark Rudd talked about going into the working class areas of Chicago and intermixing with the greasers, as they called them. The Italian working class kids, the Polish working class kids. And these kids told him, get out of here. We don't want your stinking communism, right? It was Rudd and those guys, heirs from a wealthy family, Rudd, who went to Columbia. It's usually the intellectuals that buy into these ideas. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, almost the entire leadership of the Khmer Rouge, they were all educated in Paris. Not in Asia. They were educated. They were Asian, but they went to Paris. Pol Pot went to Paris to study radioelectricity, as it was called, and his sister even said, he left the home a lovely child, as she put it. She said the contemptible Pot was a lovely child. And then he went off and he became radicalized. And, Marx and Engels, they got their start in Paris, of all places. So it's kind of funny, too, how you have American progressives and liberals and socialists and democratic socialists, as they call themselves, talking about how progressive they are and their evolution in thought. And also, they used to use this phrase, TJ, when I was in college. They talked about dwems. They called them dead white European males, right? These were bad guys, dead white European males. Well, I got news for you. Marx and Engels are dead white European males, okay? The entire Frankfurt School, from Herbert Marcuse to Wilhelm Reich to Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, all those guys who invented cultural Marxism are dead white European males. They're all German guys. They're all German white guys. So how progressive are your ideas when you're just going back to 19th century socialism? So really there's just certain dwems they don't like, or certain older ideas they don't like, maybe certain American founding fathers and so forth, right? But when it comes to other 19th century German philosophers, hey, cool stuff.
So let's touch base. So I wrote here a line that says, if you want to molest women and boys without reprisal, communist dictator, Hollywood power broker are really your best options, right? So You mentioned Wilhelm Reich. I don't have any notes on here about him, but I remember vividly what you wrote about Wilhelm. And then you look at Marx, who was a horrible, detestable head of a household. I mean, just a really lousy guy in real life.
And a racist.
And a racist. And you talked about how every utopia starts with the personal crusade of the founder of that ideology, right? Or some extent of everyone brings their personal baggage to their revolution. So let's talk about, I mean, Chairman Mao and these guys who had these giant harems. They would pull girls out of school. They would kill their families if they said anything. And they would diddle with young girls and young boys. And that's part of the benefit of being able to be a servant of the people, right? We saw it then. We see it now in Hollywood. That's what they're working towards. Why?
Yeah, in fact, both of the two most recent Kims, the last Kim had his so-called Satisfaction Corps, as it was called. And this Kim has his Pleasure Squad. And these are girls, these are North Korean girls, preferably virgins, is what they wanted initially, and they had them plucked from the countryside. Mao did the exact same thing, and they brought them to the master to serve the master. And Mao, who was this pig who had chronic venereal disease, refused to bathe, refused to use deodorant, and refused to brush his teeth. And he would pass on venereal disease to all these girls, the daughters of the revolution. And a lot of them he would get pregnant. And ditto, too, for the Kims. Wilhelm Reich, the phrase, the sexual revolution, comes from Wilhelm Reich, who wrote a book by that same name. Wilhelm Reich was a Freudian Marxist, another dead white German European male. And he was one of the founders of one of the leading intellectuals in the Frankfurt School of cultural Marxism, and he was a complete freak. He was a total pervert, by anyone, even by the modern definitions of our more libertine members of modern American society. They'd have to call Reich a freak and a pervert, but these guys were pushing for redefinition of sexuality, especially the Frankfurt School, redefinition of gender, and a lot of the stuff on redefinition of marriage, family, gender, and sexuality comes from the modern New Left disciples of the Frankfurt School of cultural Marxism.
If you suggest that these what they would consider perverted or deviant lifestyles are based in some kind of experience, right? If it's I forget the term I'm going to use, but that somehow those are created and not born, people get very offended by that. But Wilhelm Reich's a good study. I mean, he was the one who fantasized about jumping in bed with his mom and her step boyfriend. Wasn't that him?
Yes, it was. Yeah. He was. By the way, can I plug in on something here real quick? I think my power is going to die.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. If you suggest in this argument between nature and nurture, right, that the sexual deviancy or perversion or however you wanted to find it, things that are deemed unnatural, at least historically, are products of circumstance and you're not born that way, people kind of get a little offended by that. They just don't want to believe that maybe those things happen as a result of other actions. But Wilhelm Reich's actually an interesting study in that. I mean, the guy was a major deviant, and I think you wrote in your book, I got to check my notes, that he had an episode where he would fantasize about having sex with his mother while she was with her boyfriend or husband or some other random sexual partner. Help me understand that.
Well, that's right. And he was watching the farm animals. I'll put that in a kind of mild way, right? During this time, he was trying to have sex with his nanny when he was, 6, 7, 8 years old, which is totally unnatural. I'm a
and
father.
And he was successful, right? Didn't he pull that off eventually?
Yeah, he tried to anyway. And I mean, that's just not natural to a little boy at that age, right? I mean, boys start to have these inclinations. It's older than that, typically.
Yeah, I have a 7-year-old. There's no way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a lot of conflict in this among the cultural Marxists. Mark Rudd, again, who is one of the leaders of SDS, Weather Underground, led the Columbia University protests in 1968. He's still around. He's been speaking. He's trying to create a new SDS today. And he talks about how he tried to have sexual intercourse with his best friend. And they were doing this because this was part of their cultural Marxist norms of breaking down traditional taboos. traditional understandings. And Rudd just couldn't pull it off. He just and I'm reading this book where he's blaming all of this on the culture, like, oh, this damn culture. It's just so messed me up that I can't even, and it was he's very graphic about this. It's him and his best friend, and they're in bed with a girl, and they're both having sex with a girl, and he tries to do something with his friend, and he's just not into it, as he puts it. And I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, well, Mark, maybe because physically this just isn't you, okay? It's not the culture. You just don't want to do this because biologically, your nature, physically, you're not attracted to men. And gay people who are listening to me right now, I imagine would agree with this. They'd be like, yeah, Mark, you weren't interested in this because you're not gay. But see, Mark Rudd was blaming it on the culture. As a cultural Marxist, to him, this was a cultural taboo that was getting in his way. So you had to redefine these things in the culture. You had to redefine sexuality. Again, Marx and Engels. Communism is the most radical rupture in traditional relations. So they're literally trying to redefine human nature, which is another reason bringing us back why you have to take God out of this. Why you have to take the scriptures out of this, because they say things that, they put in place certain moral absolutes that get in the way of the project of fundamental transformation that you're trying to launch.
Yeah, and before we're done, I definitely want to talk about Margaret Sanger and this whole idea of destroying the family. One thing I didn't know is you talk about her actually going to Russia, as a lot of these revolutionaries did. You brutalized FDR. His entire cabinet went and met with Russia. They all thought he was a great man. And FDR is basically partially responsible for the whole Eastern Bloc and the Berlin Wall and letting all this stuff happen. But when Margaret Sanger went to Russia, she's the one who said we have to get rid of noxious weeds and useless humans. And she was a violent racist herself. She goes to Russia, sees what they're doing with divorce and abortion, and kind of goes, whoa, like, what are we doing here? This is a little overkill. And that's always hilarious to me when a socialist like Woodrow Wilson looks at people who are manifesting the deeper part of the ideology and say, hang on, this is not what I envisioned. This is not where we're supposed to go with this. Help me understand what happened with Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, she was the founder of Planned Parenthood, which at that point, when she went to the Soviet Union, she did not yet support abortion. It had been the American Birth Control League, and she wanted abortion. She wanted birth control for purposes of things like eugenics. Yeah, she was involved in a Negro project. She spoke to the Silver Lake, New Jersey chapter, women's chapter of the KKK in May 1926. That's on pages 366 to 367 of her 1938 autobiography. Just look it up. She writes about it. She writes about it approvingly. They loved her. She was such a hit that she missed her train. She stayed so long. She said 12 additional speaking offers were made to her. She was such a hit. But when she got to Russia in 1934 to check out what they were doing with birth control, she was shocked by the number of abortions. And I quote in the book, TJ, this amazing statement from her, which is kind of typical of the progressive socialist mind, where she said, basically, no fear, because the Soviet officials, the communist officials that I spoke to said that as soon as the communist policies are put in place, neither abortion or contraception will be necessary. A fully functioning communistic society will take care of all of these needs. So again, just give us more power. Just give us more control of the administrative state. Let us really do what we want to do for people, and we will bring in the utopia. You won't even need contraception and abortion. So it was an amazing statement, expression of the sort of progressive mind.
Yeah, there's never, and you mentioned the book, there's never the Shark Tank part of it where you show me the business plan, you show me the budget, you show me the roadmap to get all these things done. It's, look, as soon as we're finished, all your concerns will be laid to rest. And she said, okay, good enough for me. I'll go home.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's a classic.
I know you got a jet. I want to finish with the last thing here, which is I mentioned Woodrow Wilson because he didn't like the Bolsheviks. He actually understood that they were very dangerous and this revolution was going to be bloody. And I think to myself, if you do a Venn diagram or a plus minus chart on what these men believe, the doctrine is similar. The application is different. And much like in the religious world, if you share the same doctrine, ultimately you're just going to disagree on application, you're going to get a similar result. And I had to laugh because this is very similar with FDR. He actually thought Stalin was a great guy, and he promised Stalin he could have whatever he wanted, nothing in return. And he admitted to his cabinet that he didn't get a good deal, but he kind of, like Margaret Sanger, he trusted him. He thought his heart was in the right place. This blows my mind. Can we talk about fellow travelers and why they don't see the forest through the trees?
Yeah, the fellow travelers are a big problem. And Woodrow Wilson, to his credit, he said, these guys are barbarians. I mean, these guys are bad. They're not on the left. They're not on the progressive left. These guys are brutal atheists. So Wilson got that right. Margaret Sanger did not. FDR did it. George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, John Dewey. John Dewey, basically the founding father of American public education. John Dewey is honorary president for life of the National Education Association. I mean, when you go into a PhD program in education, you basically genuflect at the Dewey statue when you walk into the department, right? And Dewey was horribly misled about the Soviets. So, and I think this is probably a good way to end this too. A lot of people, and not that any of those people were communists, they weren't. And this is the problem. The problem is people on the general wider left, socialists, social democrats, if that's what you want to call them, liberals, progressives, who don't fully understand how bad communism and the communists are. They're the ones that get duped. They're the ones that get used. And the communists have always understood that, right? The communists always understood, our suckers are on the religious left. They're on the broader left in education. Forget the anti-communist and the conservative side. They know what we're up to. Right? We're not going to fool them. But we can get. There might be only 100 of us or 10 of us in this room, but I bet we can get 10,000 if we reach out to that wider group in the name of social justice or workers' rights or whatever else. And liberals listening to me right now, you ignore this at your peril. And this is why you need to teach the horrors of this extremist ideology of what lies on your far left. Because if you don't, people on your own side and your own group are going to be victims to it as well.
Yeah, that's a great close. I think your book does a really good job of creating a timeline, saying here's what they believed, here's the language they used, here's what they wanted to accomplish, here are the people they targeted. It all aligns to what you're seeing today in terms of social justice, in terms of being Grubered, right? And admitting, look, some people are dumb enough, we can basically control them if we just sell it the right way. And after they buy it and start selling it themselves, then it's too late. It's over. And I appreciate your work. I think everyone should go out and buy the book. You've got several other books. Give me the next 2 they should read after they're done, because there's like a list of 20 here. So I need to know where to start too.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. Well, I just did a book called A Pope and a President on John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, and how they worked together to defeat Soviet communism. So I'd recommend that one. And also did a book called Takedown on how these far left elements have tried to redefine, sabotage the family and marriage in particular, which I think would be it's a short book. It's probably the shortest one I've written. And I think that's one that this audience in particular would really benefit from.
Well, maybe I'll give it a read, and then maybe I can have you back on to finish up this discussion, because I think it's fascinating and we should be talking about it more often. So I appreciate it, Doctor.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, TJ.
All right, good luck in academia. Are you tenured already, or are you still in danger of being run out on rail?
At Grove City College, we don't have tenure. I could give you a whole conversation just on Grove City College. This is one of the rare conservative colleges in America.
You're letting ideas compete in the marketplace. That's a dangerous venture.
We really do.
Thank you again. I appreciate your time, and good luck with the book.
All right, take care.